Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this subject. And I think sometimes it's a very difficult discussion for people to have in different social, political, and cultural contexts. Let me explain what I mean. First, by understanding what it says with Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir identifies itself as an ideological group. They are a group that like to talk about ideas. They like to describe themselves as an intellectual entity. They say what they are doing is political activity. And they explain they're not a charity group. They're not raising money to help people. They are not a material group, meaning they're not trying to engage in material activities. They're not trying to engage in what they would describe as militant activism. They are not a group that is educational. They themselves say we are not an educational group. We're not trying to teach people things. However, we are an ideological group which is political. So they self-describe as a group which holds a distinct ideology, a view of life, a political system that comes from that view, and they have a group which embraces that view of life, builds that ideology, inculcates it in its personalities, and then when the people embrace this group, they become members of this group. They will take an oath, very, very old-fashioned. They will take a qasam, and they will swear, La uqsim billahi al-azim, I swear by Allah the Great, and akunu harisan aminan lil-Islam, to be a faithful guardian of Islam. And they will then be very specific to adopt the ara Hizb ut-Tahrir, the views of Hizb ut-Tahrir, wa nafidan qiraratihi, to enforce the decisions, وَأَثِقًا بِقِيَادَتِهِ, to have trust in its leadership, مَا دُمْتُ عُدْوَانًا فِيهِ, as long as they're a member of it, وَاللَّهُ عَلَى مَا أَقُولُ شَهِيدٌ, and then they will give an oath by God as a witness to this. So they're very, very specific that they are an ideological group with distinct thoughts, distinct method, a political system, which they as a group are unified on and want to bring about. So it's a very, very modern phenomena. That's the first thing to understand. When I say modern, in the sense that Islam has never had mandated, obliged, as they claim, political parties. This is a very new thing. So they have a unique interpretation of the Quran, which says, oh, the Quran actually obligates political parties. And they quote a verse of the Quran, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, let there arise from you a people that call to good. يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, they enjoin what is known to be right. وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ, they forbid what is known to be wrong. وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ, and they are the successful party. Or they are the successful. And so they say this means you need to have an ideological political party. Obviously, the notion of political party is very modern. Obviously, the notion of ideology and their structures are very modern. Obviously, the concept of having a Islamic ideological political party is unheard of in Islamic history or Islamic jurisprudence. If you pick up any one of the books of fiqh, that I have behind me from the Sunni and the Shi'i and the Madhahib, you will never have a discussion of Bab Ahzab al-Siyasi, a chapter on political parties. This is a modern heresy which they've invented, saying Islam obligates a specific political party with distinct characteristics. So this is their self-definition. This is their unique interpretation. And this is how to kind of see that this is a very specific ideological orientation. Once we recognize this and we can detach it from the way Islam has been understood, taught, and practiced for 1400 years, we can then start to see how and why they become very, very unique in their interpretations of Islam. And then we can situate that in a context to try and understand what's been going on, where they are, and why do they recruit, and how do they recruit. So the argument is the Muslims for 700 years, for 1400 years, lived under, 1300 years, lived under a caliphate. First you had the righteous caliphate, then you had the Umayyads, you had the Abbasids, you had the Ottomans, and then when the Ottomans were brought to an end by imperial governance, you had the occupation of Muslim lands, and therefore the caliphate was brought to an end. And so what we need to do is restore the Islamic State. And this is the other modern, very modern phenomenon which they have. So their concept of caliphate is not one that when you read classical works, where they will talk about having a caliph, a leader, or many caliphs even, having more than one leader in each country, or a group of countries may appoint a leader. You know, all of this is discussed in Islamic jurisprudence, where the notion of leadership is much more preferred than anarchy. And so, you know, they will say it's better to have a leader that represents and unifies Muslim communities, or Muslim countries it should appoint their own leader. Both of these positions you'll find in the works of Islamic fiqh. If you look to famous tafsirs of Quran like Imam Qurtubi's, they will say that yes, we have this ideal of unity, but Muslim countries are very far apart. They will appoint their own leaderships. Scholars who specialize to this subject, like Imam al-Jawaini, who wrote his Ghiyaf al-Umam, he will talk about, while you know you should have an ideal, but actually practically speaking, I'm not going to reject. Whenever you need to, you have different leaders in different countries. This is just a practicality. However, that concept is transformed and modernized and ideologized in a way that Hizb ut-Tahrir makes very unique. So they will say that we want an Islamic state, Dawla Islami, and they will say the state, which is an executive, which is a ruling body. An executive, what does that mean? It literally executes, it does things, and a ruling body enforces, implements things. This is what most people will say is a government. It has a legislature, it makes laws. Things are legal, things are illegal. Things which are criminalized, which have punishments, and that is part of the state. And it has a judiciary, which judges who interpret laws, they apply them on cases and universally enforce these laws. That is the entity that we will call a state, has these three pillars. And they will say the Islamic State is a caliph, enforcing his laws as the state, adopting the laws, and then appointing judges to enforce those laws. So on the one hand, they have this modern conception of state. On the other hand, their conception of state is one of totalitarian authority in the personality of the caliph, of the ruler. So it's unsurprising that their idea is totalitarian. It's very, the state enforces everything over society, and this is a religious duty to enforce and have what they call an Islamic State, one over the global Muslim community. So this is the other side which is significant for them. They describe themselves as being part of the entire Muslim nation, not part of the Arabs or the non-Arabs or Pakistanis or Asians or Turks, etc. But their identity is Muslim, not in the religious sense, because obviously many people will have Muslim identities. They'll also have, you know, a German or a British identity or European identity even, because that's your social political identity, the lens that you have. You may even have an ethnic background. You may be, you know, like people talk about American African or Brit Bangla or Brit Pakistani, or I don't know if you have this in, you know, German Turks or whatever, or German Arabs or Arab Germans. I don't know how you do that. But we have various different layers of identity. Whereas they will say, no, you're a Muslim religiously and politically, and therefore you're part of the Ummah, not in the fraternity of believers, but you are a political bloc. And the state is there as your representative as the political bloc. And the ruler, the caliph, is the singular ruler to enforce all of these things that you must swear your fealty and allegiance to. So you have one nation or one people, one state or one body, one state, and one caliph. You might have heard this before in your history when looking at it in a German context. There's a reason it sounds very totalitarian and authoritarian, because it is. Because It sounds, the slogan, one ummah, one state, one caliph, isn't very far from ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, because it's a very authoritarian and totalitarian ideology. And so you either embrace this ideology or you are outside the fold of real Islam. So as far as they are concerned, these are not negotiable tenets in Islam. As far as their identity or version of religion is concerned, this is the conception of Islam that's fundamental. That Islam is an aqidah from which a system arises, a belief system from which a whole system arises, and the political system is on top of that, and this is the caliphate. And it needs to be restored today, and then this is where the political, the religious, and the emotional arguments will come in. So look, why are Muslims being persecuted in Europe? Why are Muslims, they will say their identity is not recognized. They will say they can't practice their religion. They are criticized for wearing the niqab or the hijab. They won't say niqab, but they will say hijab. They will say that actually you can't live a Muslim life without the Sharia, and therefore you need to have an Islamic state in an ideal way. Why are Muslims in the Palestinian territories persecuted? Why are their lands occupied? Why are they not allowed to unify? Why are they not allowed to have a real state? Because actually there is no army to defend them. There is no real government that will look after the interests of these people. There is therefore no Islamic state that will repel the occupation. And actually they'll go further. They will say not only occupied lands, but all lands, destroy the state of Israel. And they will go further than this. And this is where the difference lies. They will not speak in material terms that they will not go and fight, but they will say the armies need to go and fight. They will say suicide bombing is legitimate, and they will say even hijacking Israeli planes is legitimate, and they will say even if civilians are killed, this is legitimate. And they will describe this as their religious fatwa. Now, most Muslims will turn around and say, well, actually, this sounds very, very strange. Islam long ago, several centuries ago, and I can show you from any of the different schools of Islamic thought, will tell you very clearly that killing civilians is absolutely forbidden, even in the height of warfare. When the Prophet came across this in his time where individuals had killed, the hadith, which is well transmitted by dozens of companions, so it's undisputed, Imam Nawawi in his commentary on Sahih Muslim mentions, أجمع العلماء على تحريم القتل النساء والولدان. The scholars have always agreed, there's a consensus, always agreed of the prohibition of killing women and children. And the hadith mentioned أنكروا إنكارا شديدا قتل النساء والولدان. The Prophet condemned in a severe manner the killing of women and children. And this is in all of the books of hadith and all of the books of fiqh, and all of the, when you study these texts, they will tell you we are absolutely forbidden from killing non-combatants and people that are not engaging in fighting. In fact, the Prophet in the battlefield said, La taqtulul asif, don't kill those people that are just merely, they're not fighters, they are serving people, they're dealing with people, they are, and so on. So these regulations, which in their modern ideological context, they will say, well, this is an occupation, the land is occupied, suicide bombing is something that is done in order to remove these people from the occupied territory, therefore it's okay. It doesn't matter that killing civilians is forbidden. It doesn't matter that suicide is something alien to Islam. And all of the ulama, you'll find this in many of the books of fiqh, you're not allowed to be musabbibul qatl, you're not allowed to be the cause of your own death, even in the battlefield. So even if it was legitimate, that tactic is something that's forbidden. And therefore, this description of the entire world as Darul Kufr, as a land of disbelief because there's no caliphate, the description of the entire world as Darul Harb, as a land of war, and the description of occupied territories as legitimate places where these tactics can be undertaken, demonstrate a certain ideological mindset, which they won't go and tell people at the beginning of recruitment, but once you're embedded in the ideology, you will learn and study that you will see that actually this worldview, which says either a caliphate or nothing. Dar al-Islam is the enforcement of their version of the Islamic State. Everything else is Dar al-Kufr, Dar al-Harb, the land of disbelief, the land of war. That this binary vision is ideological and very impure to Islam. And the resultant fatwas, even if they are not material and they do not go and fight and they do not engage in warfare, the ideology does justify not only warfare, but tactics which are used by terrorists, the legitimation of killing of civilians, and specifically differentiating it for Jews within the Israeli context, that their civilians can be killed. Now, this is why in different geopolitical contexts, they're either illegal, activism is illegal, or they can operate, but certain actions are forbidden. So in the UK, in the US, where there isn't the cultural history there is in Germany, obviously they are not forbidden and they're not banned. In the US, which has absolute free speech, all their activism is allowed. In the UK, their activism is allowed as long as they don't incite terrorism. They don't go around inciting people to engage in violent acts against civilians for political motive. Actually, otherwise expressing other parts of the ideological narrative is perfectly acceptable. In a German context, they're banned as an organization. The membership is not, activism is, due to very specific things: protection of the constitution, protection of the, against anti-Semitism. Given Germany's history, there's very understandable reasons for those legislations, and that's why they're banned. In the Muslim majority countries, their methodology is revolutionary. So you have a political party, it convinces the society of their version of caliphate, it tries to take power by way of influencing the military and then having a military coup. And then utilizing the military coup to appoint a caliph, and then you have one single state. And gradually you bring down all other states with no diplomatic relations. You either cause revolutions or you use your military to take over those states. And therefore you unify all the Muslim majority countries into a single caliphate. That's their vision. And that's their policy and their strategy. And that's why they are banned in most Muslim majority countries, because they want to cement a coup, which is illegal. Secondly, they are persecuted in horrendous ways. And just because their ideology is extreme and their tactics are going to be illegal, it doesn't justify the type of persecution you have. So many countries will arrest them, lock them up at trial, many will torture and persecute them. But that's because many of these countries lack basic human rights. Many of these countries are not democratic in nature. And many of these countries actually are vicious in their war against their own peoples, whether you look at Syria, whether you look at Uzbekistan, whether you look at many of the states which have fairly repressive regimes. There's a spectrum of how repressive, how tyrannical, how authoritarian they are. So there's a lot of persecution. And this brings me to why are they effective in recruitment? Because there is persecution, there is occupation of Muslim territories, there is economic backwardness, there is an identity conflict, and there is Islamophobia, i.e. there is a conflict around Islam and its role in modern Muslim societies and Western societies. So these ideological, intellectual, and political issues can easily be jumped on by likes of Hizb ut-Tahrir and other Islamist groups to say you have these grievances, Islam has a solution to all of these things, the Islamic State is the enforcement of those solutions, and Islam as an ideology can be imposed by a caliphate. This is what a home for Islam is, Dar al-Islam is. Now we can go through each of these things. I mentioned why political parties are modern heresy. I mentioned why their version of a caliphate is a modern state. Classically in Islam, the ulama, the scholars had debates about fiqh, about sharia. There were different schools of thought, different madhahib. Even amongst Sunnis, there are 4 popular schools of practice. There's a saying, if you ask, religious people Get 2 religious people in a room, get 2 Jews in a room, you have 3 opinions. Get 4 Muslims, you have 5 opinions. This is the same. The point being is that Muslims have different religio-political ideas. They have different ethical ideas, they have different religious interpretations. So there's never been a singular ideological singularity. The role of the state was not to enforce one school on everybody. Governance was restricted. Different schools of thought had different legal traditions. If you look at, I have a book here from the second century of Islam, the first century, Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, one of the early Muslim scholars, where he speaks of non-Muslims having their own marriages, their own courts, their own rules for marriage, and even things that Muslims find very, very difficult to deal with. Zoroastrians had a tradition of intermarriage within their own families. But if this was something by free will, if this was something they chose to do, if this was part of their religious teachings, their own courts, they could do this. The groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir would say having their own courts is kufr. It's unbelief. It's not allowed in Islam. Yet classically, the way they interpreted the Quran was that every people should have their own judges and they would enforce their own religious teachings. Different schools of thought, different religions, different sects. This existed for 1400 years, so the concept of caliphate is ahistoric. There was always more than one caliph, whether it's in Spain, whether it's in Andalus, or whether it was in the Abbasid period. The Ottomans never governed over all Muslim countries, whether it's the Safavids or the Indian Mughals. The Mughals claimed sultanate and caliphate. We always had multiple leaderships, and Islamic scholarship has always recognized this. So that ideology at root is something that's antithetical to Islam and Islamic teaching. The notion of Dar al-Islam, therefore, where all rules and laws are enforced by the state and is security is in the hands of Muslims, those two conditions, even they recognize the contradiction in this. So in other works, they will say that's where the sha'air, the symbols of Islam are present. Why? Because the caliph's role was not to enforce Sharia, because even they say there are different interpretations that are valid, and it's up to the caliph to do so or not. So there's no religious duty. And they say sometimes it's a bad idea. Like historically, there was famously in the time of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who lived again 2nd and 3rd centuries we're looking at, there was persecution of Sunnis by Mu'tazila to make them believe Mu'tazila creed. It's a specific sect. They wanted Ahmad bin Hanbal to believe certain beliefs, and the caliph wanted to enforce it on everybody. Ahmad bin Hanbal, when he was being persecuted, one of the things he said was, as narrated by Ibn al-Jawzi in his Manaqib of Ahmad, he says, Ahmad bin Hanbal said, well, you have a belief, I have a belief, why, you hold your belief, I hold mine. So even they recognize this was a trouble, a fitna, and actually it can be bad for the state to have a religious dimension, creedally, and in religious worships. So even this contradiction is within their own works. This is why Dar al-Islam was always a land where people can practice their religion, can manifest the sha'air, the symbols of Islam, have mosques. I mentioned this in my book that you mentioned, the Guide to Refuting Jihadism, that actually any homeland for Islam was anywhere where the Muslim symbols were present. The Prophet said, if they have a masjid or you hear the adhan, then you don't go and invade that country because they are permitted to have mosques. There's free practice of religion. And so free practice of religion became the criteria for many, many Muslim scholars. Going back to Imam Nawawi or even Imam Mawardi, the famous author of the Sultanate, Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, the rules of authority, where he describes any land where Muslims are able to practice their religion and say they're a Muslim openly, that is a homeland for Islam. So this actually becomes, you can see how ideologically is so far from their perspectives. And then you look at these specific ideas, these things are very, very distant. I think I've got maybe 5 minutes. So I'm just going to end on, why is it then that their recruitment is effective? Their recruitment is effective for 3 reasons. They appeal to identity, who you are. Are you Muslim? Are you German? Are you Muslim? Are you European? Are you Muslim? Are you British? Are you Muslim? Are you Arab? And they will say the identity is Muslim and your Islam is all encompassing. They will utilize intellectual theology and they will talk about why empiricism versus logic and how or rationale, they will say. The right logic needs to be curtailed by what you can sense. what you can sense is things are limited and there's a beginning, the universe has a beginning. All these things must have a cause. The cause cannot be part of this universe, has to be separate. It can't be created because then it would need a creator. Ergo, there's an unlimited, without beginning, eternal creator that's external to the universe. They will discuss rationally why the Quran couldn't have come from the Arabs. They failed to produce it. They were challenged. They rather fought wars, persecuted, and then, rather than produce something similar to the Quran, they failed as a society. They went to war, they lost, and eventually even they embraced Islam, and then Islam spread amongst them because of the power of the Quran. They will talk about the miracles, the systems, the better economic ideas, how capitalism needs to failure, how communism already failed, how market failures require other solutions, how Islam deals with the market and gives some things for the public, gives some things for the state, gives curtailing of unjust practices of usury, has a complete economic system. And then they will utilize scripture. They will cite verses of the Quran regarding jihad, regarding ruling, regarding being part of the ummah. And they will utilize these things to mean very specific ideological, political perspectives that they hold, as opposed to the way classically Islam dealt with these things. And so they will create this us and them marker, and they will reject notions of democracy. It doesn't matter that even most Islamists have embraced democratic practice. It doesn't matter that the ones who have been successful, like the ones in Tunisia and Nahda, have rejected the ideological extreme and embraced basic freedom and liberty, human rights and democracy. They will say, no, this is alien to Islam. Even if most Muslim scholarships will talk about human rights and democracy, as far as they're concerned, these things are kufr. So they will create this dichotomy, this us and them narrative. And then, because if most individuals are not familiar with classical Islamic scholarship, they will present what they say as the only Islamic view that's legitimate, and everyone else is misguided. Eventually, you'll see through this. Eventually, you'll recognize their interpretations are unique. You'll recognize their ideology is extreme. You'll recognize the danger of what they possess, because you will see that even Salafi jihadist groups that come from them, whether it's Jihad al-Islami, Tanzim al-Jihad, whether it's al-Muhajirun, whether it's the manifestations of Muhajirun in Britain, first started by Omar Bakri Muhammad, a former member of Hizb ut-Tahrir and leadership figure in the UK, who started a Salafi jihadi group. And they will talk about us and them narratives, rejecting democracy, rejecting human rights, having a caliphate, enforcing Sharia, all from the language of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which they have embraced. And then you'll see this concept of Dawla Islamiyya massively affecting Al-Qaeda and Jihadi Salafis. And you see this manifest in groups like what was ISIS, and their recruiters in Germany who have the same ideological beliefs. And we have a report that just came out looking at Salafi trends, Salafism, not as just as a religious group. 95% may not be violent. 70% are not even talking in an extreme manner. But actually, many have these cultural extreme attitudes, and many even embraced by ideas from Islamist ideologies like Hizb ut-Tahrir. And actually, what we found in the German context, the influence of the Salafi jihadi narrative that came from offshoots has now shaped the ideology that has been proselytized in a German context. Those reports are on our website, and you can have a look at the isdglobal.org. But there's a number of reports on Salafism. And one of them looks at the German context, and you'll be able to see actually the influence of groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir and their ideology on these groups, and how they're being proselytizing and presenting themselves as a distinct, unique, only true brand of faith. And obviously this can be, as I've tried to show, you can tear it apart, you can show it's modern, you can show it's heretical in terms of Islamic teachings. You can show they have distorted, use the same words, but they have unique interpretation and understanding, and they've distorted classical Islamic teachings. And then you'll be able to demonstrate why their ideological revolution is not authentic Islam, but it's still one that's effective, because they're effective at recruiting through political engagement, through channeling grievances, through linking to causes that are important, through taking ideological and intellectual debates, and through connecting that back to their own ideological perspective. I'll end there. And if you have any comments, questions, corrections, clarifications, or points you want to make, please feel free